All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Housing 101, Building and Advocating for the Homes We Need. We are going to have a great session today, and this is the first workshop in the 2023-2024 Lower Cape Housing Institute. Go. Make sure I have my view correct. Okay. So let's dive in. Welcome, welcome. These are all the questions that we're going to explore today. I included them in our, our workshop description. As we get started, we're going to go through who is in the room. So if everyone would jump into the chat and let us know what your name is, what town you're affiliated with, and if you serve on a board or a committee. So that's your first piece of homework to make sure you're paying attention. As we move through the workshop, we've got a great mix of people here this morning. So we are coming to this with different levels of knowledge and education and experience with affordable housing. So I'm asking everyone to just be respectful, listen. If you've got questions, as I said, hold them to the end, and we'll address everyone's questions and concerns as best we can. You can always reach me after the fact if we don't quite get to cover everyone's questions today. I'm going to let Jay Coburn, our CEO, talk about the organization, the CDP.
Good morning and welcome, everyone. I'm the president and CEO of the Community Development Partnership, a resident of Provincetown, and I want to welcome you to this Housing 101 session. I'm really glad to see so many of you here. For over 3 decades now, the Community Development Partnership has been leading the Lower Cape and building a diverse year-round community of people who can afford to live, work, and thrive here. And we do that by promoting, developing, and managing affordable housing, as well as nurturing the launch of small businesses and facilitating collaboration with businesses, nonprofits, and government partners.
Thank you so much, Jay. I failed to give my name and title. I'm Amanda Beverid. I am the Director of Housing Advocacy, and I oversee the Lower Cape Community Housing Partnership. And that has 3 prongs, one of which is the Lower Cape Housing Institute. So through traditional community organizing and leadership development strategies, along with a series of workshops and trainings, the Lower Cape Community Housing Partnership increases the capacity of towns to meet the housing needs of their residents, and we do this in 3 ways. So the Lower Cape Housing Institute is to train elected and appointed municipal officials and staff. We do this by holding a series of workshops that equip town officials with the knowledge, resources, and skills needed to help their towns create housing opportunities. Some outcomes of these goals are to see towns implement changes in their zoning bylaws that support affordable housing development, and we cover that in our annual town meeting summary every year. We're also looking for increases in the number of affordable housing units on each town's subsidized housing inventory, or SHI or SHI if you're on the Cape. We also look to see towns increase their utilization of CPA, or Community Preservation Act funding, for affordable housing. And again, we track that through our annual town meeting summaries. All right, so a little bit of housekeeping. We will be sending out the materials afterwards via email. We are going to do our very best to keep this to the time allotted. If you have questions, you can raise your hands, but to the best of your ability, if you could hold those to the end, that would be fabulous. All right, so we are going to talk about housing. That's what we're here for today. So what is housing and why is it so important? Your home is where you spend most of your life. It's where you sleep, where you grow, where you experience relationships, and people cannot bring their whole selves to any other aspect of their lives when their home is not safe or stable. So housing meets 3 of our basic human needs. It meets our physical needs by providing us shelter. It meets our physiological needs by providing us safety, and meets our social needs by giving us a place to have family and relationships. what does a healthy community look like with a healthy supply of housing? Housing is really the foundation of a healthy community. And without housing, families are under stress. The lack of housing undermines mental and physical health. Kids can't arrive at school ready to learn. Families can't save for emergencies or retirement or college, and people can't manage the unexpected. So a community with a healthy supply of housing actually looks better. It's more interesting and it has more character. Roof lines are broken up and the community might look more like a village than a suburb. In a healthy community, you'll be able to see a variety of sizes and types of housing, homes that are well sited, and there are good transitions between commercial and residential areas, and housing that is close to the center of town that encourages walkable communities. This is known as village-centered development. This website, missingmiddlehousing.com, is a great resource to give you a sense of all the different housing types besides just single-family homes that can fit into our communities to give residents more affordable options. Healthy communities have energy-efficient home options. Energy efficient and decarbonized homes save residents money by lowering utility costs, and they're also climate resilient. Not only are they cheaper to live in, but energy efficient communities are walkable because homes are sited close to transportation, work, and amenities. A healthy community is also demographically diverse. And a community with a healthy supply of housing has homes available for all kinds of people. So these communities are diverse in every sense, especially racially, economically, and in terms of family size and structure. So what is affordable housing? Affordable housing usually means housing that is priced to be affordable to households making between 30 and 88% of area median income. And Jay is going to talk a little bit later about exactly what AMI is. So this glossary right here is a great resource to help you understand a lot of the basic terms that we use when we discuss affordable housing, and we'll include that in our materials that we send out after this workshop. So what does affordability mean? So when we're talking about affordable housing, we mean that a home is affordable when a household spends no more than 30% of their income on housing costs. A household that spends more than 30% of their income on housing costs is considered to be cost burdened. And people who are cost burdened can't afford to pay for other things associated with a good standard of living, like food, healthcare, education, emergencies, savings, all the things that are really important to a good quality of life. So oftentimes you hear us talk about big A versus small a affordable housing. Homes can be affordable just because how they're priced in a naturally occurring rental or real estate market, or they can be affordable because they're created specifically to be affordable for an income range. So naturally occurring affordable housing is built without government subsidy and yet is still priced affordably for most people in the area. And for a variety of reasons that we're going to touch on, our region and the private sector has really not done a good job producing housing that is affordable for the people who live here year round. And this is why it's so important for our towns to intervene, because our market is not serving this very basic need for housing in our communities. That brings us to capital A, affordable housing, which is subsidized and regulated. So it's really important that we provide this critical resource to our community so that we can have a community at all. And we do this by intervening in the public sector to provide land and other resources in order to subsidize the creation of housing. And two common mechanisms for doing that are Chapter 40B and the Local Initiative Program. So Chapter 40B is a state statute that provides developers relief from restrictive zoning and an expedited and comprehensive permitting process in exchange for at least 25% of the units that are created being held as affordable units. This has created the most affordable housing in the state compared to any other mechanism, and it also provides an incentive to towns that meet this 10% threshold. It's very interesting. We could do a whole class just on 40B. And we have. So why don't we have a healthy supply of housing on the Cape? specifically on the Lower Cape. One of the reasons for this is that housing costs are a function of supply and demand. And we have a documented low supply of housing and housing production. And we know that that exists because of the affordability gap. So as we talked about before, households that are spending 30% or more of their monthly income on housing are cost burdened. And the number of households that are cost burdened is indeed the affordability gap. We are a resort destination. We have a tourist industry. And then on top of that, we also had the COVID-19 pandemic, which has really exacerbated a lot of existing conditions and pushed this crisis to a place that we just haven't seen before. So we can look at some data compiled from the last census by the Cape Cod Commission. So this shows what it costs to, or what sort of income you have to own, and what the median household income is. So for the Outer Cape in Truro, as of the last census, local median income was around $69,000, and the income needed to buy was around $142,000. In the years since the census data came out, that number has really ballooned. I think if you would all mute yourselves on Zoom.
Okay.
Thank you so much. So I think the latest numbers in Truro, it was about $350,000 needed to afford a house. And then if we look over to Chatham's data, on the Lower Cape, median household income as of the census was about $78,000, and to own affordably, you need to make an income of about $184,000. And again, those numbers have gone up quite a bit since the census data came out. But the long and short of it is that local earners are just not making enough to compete and be able to buy homes to stay here. So where does this market disconnection come from? For starters, the cost to build on Cape Cod is more expensive than building over the bridge. So pre-COVID, building one unit of housing off Cape was about $350,000. Post-COVID, or during COVID, it went up to about $400,000 per unit on Cape. And now that we're sort of post-COVID, projects that are either recently completed or are currently under construction or going through the permitting process are ranging anywhere from $500,000 per unit all the way up into the mid 600s and even into the $700,000 per unit. So affordable housing costs less to the resident, but it costs just as much to build as any other type of housing, and that's why it's subsidized. And right now, construction is just very expensive. So in addition to our low supply of housing and housing production, we also have a lot of demand for housing and land that exists. At least half of the vacation homes in the state are located here on the Cape. And our market is really dictated by higher off-Cape incomes. We don't have a normal housing market, and second homeowners and short-term rentals are the market drivers that really create this affordability gap. The result is that land values are higher, and local year-rounders are always competing with the buying power of people from off-Cape. We can't talk about affordable housing and not talk about seasonal and short-term rentals. The seasonality of our economy and the demand for short-term rentals is a huge driver of our market. Certainly, short-term rentals are not unique to Cape Cod, but they exist here in a way that they don't exist in other places. Provincetown has been doing some amazing work and actually just released an updated study about their particular market and what short-term rentals look like in their town. And you can see the disconnect between what an owner could get for renting their home year-round for a 2-bedroom unit versus what they could get for renting for just 20 weeks out of the year. That price difference, or that profit gain, is about $45,000. So the math just isn't there to incentivize the private market to rent their homes year-round. All right, some other factors that impact our housing supply are zoning limitations. Whatever your zoning makes it easiest to build is what you're going to see the most of. And overwhelmingly on the Cape, what we have are single-family homes on 1-acre lots. And changing zoning can be is quite the process. And a lot of the towns in our region are working on shifting zoning to make it easier to build anything other than single family homes. If everybody could mute themselves on Zoom, that would be great. Other things that limit our housing supply, infrastructure. This is a big one. Zoning is limited by the availability of municipal water and sewer, which determines how many people can occupy a unit of land. And historically, our towns have resisted creating infrastructure for fear of encouraging development and overdevelopment, especially multifamily housing development. And recently, we've been seeing septic and water quality issues being cited as reasons not to pursue building at any sort of density. One of the biggest things that we contend with is a lack of public support or resistance to change, though maybe it is more fair to say that is a perceived lack of support. Many people support housing because everyone needs somewhere to live, but especially the people who need housing are working multiple jobs, taking care of children, or just unable or uncomfortable speaking up at a town or board or committee meeting. So we're going to talk about NIMBYism, and the purpose of sharing some categories of NIMBYism is for all of you to know what you can expect to hear, to understand how to respond to these concerns, and to understand that these voices don't represent our entire community. So Boston University did a study a couple of years ago that showed that most of the people who show up at planning board meetings to voice their concerns are disproportionately older, male, white, and homeowners. They provide a very specific and limited point of view and are shaping our local policies about how land is used and is not used. So, NIMBYism, not in my backyard. People who are not supportive of housing are known as NIMBYs, and no matter where you are, it's a lot of the same beats. So you can prepare for these arguments, but it's still important to listen and to address people's concerns when they are reasonable. One of the first categories is fiscal, and this is the group of people who believe that mixed-use village-style development will create a major fiscal negative. One of the biggest myths around affordable housing is that it is going to bring in this giant influx of children into a community. And actually, the data shows that single-family homes contribute more children to a community than affordable housing does. It's also worth noting that our region is revamping or rebuilding schools for populations of children that currently don't exist. The next big NIMBY concern is traffic. Many times these aren't super well-founded concerns, but either way, you can know for sure by doing a peer-reviewed traffic study and make the case for village-centered development that will minimize traffic because people can park their car and walk around and don't have to rely on vehicle-based traffic to be able to access amenities and do the things that they like to do. All right, density. This tends to be a little bit of a four-letter word when we talk about housing. But density is not a bad thing. But there's a group of people who believe that mixed-use village-style development will create something completely out of character, and it will be a big mistake for the community. So it's really important to reframe the density conversation around design and around place. People say that density is ugly, but that's really a myth. I mean, anything can be built ugly, anything also can be built beautifully. And dense development certainly qualifies as something that can be built beautifully, and there are a lot of great examples across New England. Our dense towns are also known as being really charming, and on Cape Cod specifically, the places cited as being sort of quintessentially Cape Cod are places that we could not build today under existing zoning. Places like downtown Chatham, Provincetown, and Harwichport are all densely built places that we couldn't recreate today. So a way to help move your communities through density concerns is to focus instead on a visual preferences, what people like, instead of, you know, is this appropriate for your town, or do you like this particular thing? You can help people focus on particular aspects like height, setback, exterior, sort of aesthetic design. And if there's a lot of resistance to this, this is an important thing not to do online, but to handle in person. All right. Last but certainly not least is a concern about those people and others. Some people really have the wrong ideas about who needs or lives in affordable housing, and it's really important not to let these ideas run rampant in our community without addressing them. People tend to agree that we want to attract more young families to our region, and the only way we can do that is if we provide them with housing. I am going to turn this over to Jay, and he is going to talk about who needs housing.
Thanks, Amanda. So I think one of the things to keep in mind when we delve into who needs housing is the fact that people at all income levels need housing, and that this phenomena of a need for affordable housing is not just something that we face here on the Lower Cape, or even just on Cape Cod, or even in Massachusetts, but that it is really a crisis across the nation. And in fact, there are only a couple of hundred counties in the entire country where the median price of homes is in sync with median incomes. And so most parts of the country with any kind of thriving economy are facing an affordable housing crisis, as we are here in our communities. So let's talk a little bit about the data. So knowing your data and being able to come to be able to advocate for more affordable housing is really important to have a handle on what the data is in our communities around need. And there are lots of different sources and resources to come up with this data, including the Department of Housing and Urban Development. The Cape Cod Commission, through its Data Cape Cod website, is an incredible resource. And in fact, the Commission has town-by-town fact sheets that really summarize the housing data and housing challenges in each town on Cape Cod, including the Lower Cape towns. The Cape Cod Commission has also put together a regional housing market and analysis. Massachusetts Housing Partnership Center for Housing Data is another great resource where you can go in and customize data for your community. As our websites also, Stats Cape Cod is the Cape Cod Commission's website, and Stats America. So next is really needing to understand what your housing need, and basically, what we need on the Lower Cape is more housing for people who are making low to moderate incomes. And I know that we talk a lot about the great challenges that folks making above 80% of area median income face, and the difficulty of finding housing. But also, if we look at local recent lottery data, the greatest need is actually for those with very low incomes. Those are people who are making 30% of the area median income, people who are living off of public assistance or Social Security. So it's really helpful if you do a needs assessment for your community. Here's an example of the town of Brewster's needs assessment, and towns on a regular basis need to update their housing production plans or housing needs assessments. And Brewster just has completed one. The town of Orleans is working on one, and the town of Harwich is about to work on another. So let's talk a little bit about area median income. So each spring, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development releases data for the area median income on a countywide basis. So the numbers that we work with here on the Cape are countywide. And this chart has a brief summary so that we basically kind of look at these in three different buckets. So the median family. So what we mean by median is the actual middle. So half of the families on Cape Cod or in Barnstable County are making under $120,900, and half of the families are making more than 120,000. But to qualify for the very low income units, we're talking about 4,200 a year. That's about $20 an hour. For a very low income, that's 50% of AMI, that's about $25 an hour, and 80% of 80% of median income is about $31 an hour. So just to get a sense of how this breaks down in the different, how many earners does it take to get housing, you can kind of see that in different sectors of employment, you need different number of people in order earning those income. And this is just another great illustration of the dynamic that Amanda was showing earlier, the affordability gap, and it's even worse on the Outer Cape. And just the fundamental fact here is that our housing prices are driven by people who live off Cape and make six-figure incomes in New York and Boston and points in between, and folks who work full-time here. And I think that's another thing that's really important to keep in mind, is a vast majority of the people who live in affordable housing work for a living. They just work in jobs that don't provide enough income to be able to afford to live here. So all that data is really important, and having those figures and numbers is important. But what's even more compelling and the most effective way to make the case for housing and to confront NIMBYs is stories, and helping people understand who the people are in our community and what the stories of our people who they can know or who they can identify with, who are housing challenged. And so there are lots of different ways to do that. That is to collect and share, local anecdotes about people in our community who are either seniors, a first responder, municipal employees. We have put together a media campaign at the CDP called "We Can't Afford to Lose the People Who Can't Afford to Live Here," that tells the story of folks who live and work in our community but can't afford to live here, or who are retired in our community and really struggle to find a place to live. You can find those print ads and related videos on our website. We also have on our website, and the town of Provincetown has it on their website, the stories of the people who live at Harbor Hill. And so these are residents of Provincetown who make more than 80% of AMI. And fortunately, for the 28 units of housing at Harbor Hill that are market rate, there are places for 28 families to live in Provincetown, and their stories can be seen in video on our website. And then the other thing that I think is really helpful is trying to make that data visual. And there are lots of different tools and resources to do that. Here's a link to a website called Story Maps. Also, this is a great thing that we can, at the CDP, we can help you with in trying to help tell the story of the housing challenges in your community in a visual way.
Thank you so much for that, Jay. So with all of that context sort of given, let's dive into what can affordable housing look like. And the elephant in the room is that historically, affordable housing did not used to look that great. We'll be candid. Thanks to the Fair Housing Act creating rules against segregation, we know that affordable housing developments are more successful when they mirror organic neighborhoods that are made up of diverse households, especially diverse incomes. And we often hear that towns want to produce senior housing, but the future is really intergenerational housing that allows for one-bedroom units as well as units for families. So some local examples of how great affordable housing can look. The same person can say that large single-family homes look great on their street, but the same design gets rejected when it's chopped up into 4 households instead of being one very large house. So it's really important to focus on design rather than what's going on inside, and you'll reach more supporters. Design standards is something that is working well in Barnstable. I serve on a local planning board, and sometimes using the words form-based code can be problematic. So whatever vocabulary helps move this conversation forward, that's what we're going to use. And apparently design standards is the way to go. The Cape Cod Commission did a visual preference survey in several towns, including in Eastham, and a surprising outcome was that many people were happy with more modern designs, even as they cling to ideas about community character. And this is probably because the Lower Cape has a history of modern house design. And so here's a sample of Lower Cape affordable housing developments that make sense in their town. And we have a number of them pictured here. And there are certainly others that we could include as well. All right, back to density. Housing can be dense and look good and fit in with our communities. We really need to embrace density and including focusing on developments of 40 units or more, because it takes the same amount of time, energy, and engagement to build 10 units as it does to build 100 units. And very low income households need the support of on-site property management, and developments with fewer than 40 units cannot support on-site property management. It's important to note that a major source of subsidy is the low income tax credit. And when that's removed, it leaves a huge gap other than town resources for towns to be able to build housing. And so LCHI credits can only be used for larger developments. Larger developments with increased density are the best way to have more mixed income intergenerational neighborhoods. It also helps preserve open and green space. And especially where senior housing is concerned, building at density allows for workers to live on site and be able to provide the services that our older adults need as they get older. All right. I am going to transition back to Jay, and he's going to talk about how housing gets built.
So this is the challenging part, is how do we get housing to be built? One of the best resources that really digs into the whole development process and provides lots of tools is Mass Housing Partnership's housing toolbox. It was developed by Mass Housing Partnership and CHAPA for developers and towns to work together to build housing. And I think that is one of the fundamentals to understand too, is that that towns play a key role in facilitating the creation of housing, streamlining it, making it less expensive to build through zoning, by providing resources and partnering with developers. But towns should never be in the business of developing and running their own housing. Nonprofits and private sector, the private sector are much more nimble and capable and able to do that much more effectively and much more cost efficiently. So let's talk a little bit about the development timelines and some of the highlights of that. First is planning. So it's really important to start with a housing needs assessment to really have a good sense of what is needed, and setting out some goals and strategies for meeting those needs that are identified in the housing needs assessments, and really having a clear action plan in the town about who is going to do what. What is the affordable housing committee going to be doing? What is their role? What is the Affordable Housing Trust's role? And so who does what, when, and with what money? Having a plan is really critical to being able to move forward. The next is having a development strategy. And a town really should have a clear vision about what the strategy is to develop housing and what the budget is. Often this gets done by the Affordable Housing Trust and having the trust having an action plan. But again, really clear about who, what, where, and how the community's affordable housing needs are going to be achieved. Next is then focusing on pre-development. And so this really is when we get down to, in that action plan, we have a site, and how are we going to move forward with building housing on that site? And so it's really important to do a preliminary evaluation of that site, looking at local and state regulations, having some preliminary engineering and some conceptual site design, as well as a preliminary financial feasibility analysis. This is absolutely critical. And we have seen some communities, go through a community engagement process, get lots of opinions and popular support for what housing should look like that is completely divorced from any financial feasibility. And so it may be what we want, and it may be real pretty, but it may be completely unfeasible to build, either because of the way it's designed, that it's too expensive, or because it is has an income mix for which there are no subsidies and resources other than resources that the town itself will provide at, going back to Amanda's original discussion about costs, at these days about $600,000 to $700,000 a unit if there is no subsidy available from state or local subsidy sources.
Mhm.
So once you have that kind of scope of in the pre-development of what you want to put forward, you want to put out a request for proposals to get proposals from developers to actually develop that site, but to develop within a group of range of parameters that are going to meet the needs of the community. So there's some really great resources for this in terms of guidelines for writing an RFP at Mass Housing Partnership and their Housing Toolbox. Also, Mass Housing Partnership has staff and resources available to actually work with your town planner to write an RFP. And I think this is a really, really important thing to remember, is that unless you have somebody on town staff with extensive development experience and extensive experience in writing and creating RFPs and actually has done developments, get help. That really, with help through Mass Housing Partnership, you can really put together a great RFP. And great examples of that are the residences at Lawrence Hill project that we're working on with POA and Wellfleet, that the town of Wellfleet did a great community engagement process and worked with Mass Housing Partnership to write that RFP, and ended up getting 3 great proposals from well-qualified developers. The town of Provincetown recently had, and the towns of Brewster have also had great processes of putting out RFPs and getting great proposals that really met their needs, but they got help from MHP to actually write those RFPs. Then you want to go through a process to evaluate, to select a developer, and I think it's really important to put together a group of residents, but really important to think about those residents need to have training and understanding of how to evaluate these proposals. And sometimes it's money well spent to actually bring in a consultant to work with a review committee to really truly vet these proposals and make sure that you're getting a proposal from a well-qualified developer that is financially feasible and that is indeed meeting the needs of your community. So once a developer has been selected, then it's time for the developer to begin the permitting process. And that starts with applying to the state if they're going to be using subsidies to get a project eligibility letter. And what basically that says is that this project is eligible to apply for state subsidies and to use Chapter 40B, which is typically the best way under our current zoning on the Lower Cape to be able to permit a project. But the permitting process is also a great opportunity to do a great community engagement strategy and to build public support for the project and ensure that it moves through a permitting or zoning process. And, when we first started this work, in fact, the whole Lower Cape Community Housing Partnership really comes out of our experience back in 2015 of trying to work with the developer to build affordable housing at the Tea Time site, and the recognition that our communities, that there was public opposition, but that our communities really didn't have the experience and expertise to leverage a developer to build the kind of housing it wanted. That project went down in flames, and now 7 years later, we saw the residences at Lawrence Hill and what's now known as the Province Post project, the Community Builders Project at the old VFW site in Provincetown. Both of those projects were permitted with absolutely no public opposition before their ZBAs. And that's because of the towns doing great community engagement work. Both those projects, our community organizer actually knocked on the doors of all of the abutters in seeking their support. And so it is really, really important to build that public support so that you can have a successful permitting process that doesn't then get challenged by abutters and tied up in litigation. So once the project is permitted, many projects then apply for state funding, and once state funding is achieved, then it's time to do construction, and usually the developer has a contracting firm that they work with and has great experience in doing construction oversight. Most developers also too know how to put together the marketing and lease up plan, and then also having a management plan for taking care of, if it's a rental property, they have a firm plan for being able to manage that property and plan for the long-term capital improvements that are going to be needed when a housing project is 10, 15 years old. A good management plan ensures that there's sufficient income coming into the project to be saving for capital improvements. And then finally, then it's time for the occupancy and the ongoing operations of one of the things that is really important is to make sure that you've got a really strong property management function. And I'm glad to say that most of the folks doing development in our community, POA, Penrose, and the community builders all have very strong property management functions that also include providing services to residents, helping residents connect with social services, and navigating programs to help support those families and make sure that they're successful tenants. Because remember that vacancies cost money. And so it's a good developer is going to have a great management operation that is going to support families and avoid at all costs doing evictions, because evictions are expensive. So funding, this is the big jigsaw, and there are lots of different funding sources. And it really is a puzzle that developers know how to figure out and have the resources to figure out. But one of the foundations of the funding sources is a strong partnership with the local community where the housing is being built to leverage local funds. And our local communities provide land. They provide funding, Community Preservation Act funding, Affordable Housing Trust funding. There's also local county home money and community development block grant funds on the local level. Many towns also have excess free cash that they can devote. And then we also have great sources of new revenue. We have funds coming in from the short-term rental tax, and many communities are using that short-term rental tax almost exclusively to fund affordable housing or to fund the infrastructure such as wastewater treatment that supports the creation of affordable housing. As advocates for affordable housing in our communities, I think one of the biggest questions that you can ask is what is being done with the millions of dollars from Airbnb and VRBO taxes that are coming to our communities every year for housing. It's our strong feeling that a majority of those funds, since it's short-term rentals that are one of the biggest creators of our affordable housing crisis, that we ought to be using the tax for those funds to help solve the problem that they're creating. Unfortunately, there are several communities that are not devoting a significant amount of our short-term rental tax money for housing, and it really is something that we ought to be using, particularly because it's a funding source that doesn't have an income restriction attached to it. So that is a source of funding to help create units of housing that serve families above 80% of area median income, where there's very little state or federal subsidy to create that kind of housing. There's also legislation working its way through the legislature to provide a real estate transfer tax. I think that is something that's probably going to come to reality in the next year or two. That will be another mechanism for towns. And then there's also another piece of legislation to increase the deeds excise fee tax to provide funding statewide for affordable housing and climate resiliency. Then there are state and federal sources, or two links here that talk a lot about the whole state and federal funding source mix. The primary source of funding for affordable housing is something called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, or LIHTC. And it's a very important source of equity. Like, for example, in the Lawrence Hill project, about a third of the $30+ million to build that project is coming through the low-income housing tax credit. The challenge, however, with the low-income housing tax credit is that it serves families at below 60% of area median income, and doesn't provide funding for units above 60% where we have such tremendous need. So it's a real juggling act. And that's one of the reasons why we talk about needing to have larger projects where you can have greater income diversity and meet a broad range of needs in a community. So, for example, one of the projects was just recently built about 4 years ago, the village at Nauset Green. You can see here, this was 65 units, all rental. And you can see all of the different sources of funding that came into that project from the local community. Eastham's Community Preservation Act dollars, a town subsidy for infrastructure, the money from the Eastham Affordable Housing Trust, a housing choice grant. Also, neighboring towns put resources into that project through their Community Preservation Act funding. But the big chunk of funding there was of course state funds and low-income housing tax credit, as well as some other smaller financing. And this is kind of very typical for a project to have that kind of have multiple streams of funding coming into the project. And finally, I think one of the biggest challenges around development and the financing part is this balancing act of having all of the different costs of land, construction, infrastructure, site work, the soft costs of the legal zoning costs. Like, remember, if you've got to go through a 6-month comprehensive permit process before a zoning board, all that does is drive up the costs of the project. And if you can expedite it and get it through the project, and you work together as a community to solve all the problems before it goes before the zoning board, you reduce the costs of developing that project. Because I think the most important thing for a developer is that time, or predictability, or knowing how long this is going to take, really helps make the project much more feasible and lowers the costs and makes the costs predictable.
Jay, thank you so much. So, with all of that said, what do we need to do to get the best housing? Community engagement. You cannot overstate how important community engagement is to furthering affordable housing. And the best part about what getting to the best housing that our community can have is we already know how to get it done. So when we're talking about community engagement, you have to have a great team. This is like your Avengers Assemble moment. So this slide is a bunch of the different roles and people and boards or entities that are involved in being part of your community engagement, whether that's your housing partnership or committee, which tend to be focused on policy and advocacy. Our municipal affordable housing trusts are focused on the initiatives, that trust meaning the money. Planning boards who are focused on zoning and long-range planning. And of course, we can't do any of this without our town staff, and bringing in consultants as needed for that technical expertise that may be beyond town capacity is also really important. So once you put together the team, there are a lot of different reasons that we use community engagement. So we can use it for planning, for a specific project or initiative, or for ongoing education. And for a planning scenario, you can use community engagement to help your residents think through long-range planning. So whether that's strategic plans, local comprehensive plans, housing production plans, and more, or action plans, whether that's specific to a trust or a different entity. This helps people think through our community values and our vision for what's important and what we want our communities to look like now and in the future. And these foundational documents are really important to have to be able to come back to and say, our community has weighed in on this, and these are the cornerstones of what we believe in as a community. And so these strategies help us work towards accomplishing those visions and those values. If you're doing community engagement around a specific project or initiative, this is a flyer for actually now it has a name, now it is Spring Rock Village. I'm actually an abutter of this project, and so I'm looking out my window at where it is going to be in very short time. And this was a tremendous effort on the housing office in Brewster and the town of Brewster in general to do engagement early and do it often to bring in the neighbors and abutters and the community as a whole to talk about what they wanted to see in terms of scale, in terms of appearance, what was important in terms of things like it being energy conscious and green and climate resilient. And it was just a wonderful template of how affordable housing and community engagement can be done really, really well. Lastly, you can use community engagement to do ongoing education. There are a lot of myths and misinformation that abound about what affordable housing is and isn't, who needs it, who benefits, why it's important to our community. And so there's never a time that our communities shouldn't be doing ongoing education and community engagement to help shift the narrative about what the value of affordable housing is to our communities, and frankly, what the future of our communities looks like if we don't take some really drastic action, and how maybe we're not accomplishing those long-term visions and values if we're not undertaking these things to work towards affordable housing now. So all in all, having an ongoing conversation with your town is really critical to creating a culture of support for housing. And it's really important to be creative and to be intentional and to think about who the community needs to hear from and how best to engage them. Not all strategies are going to work for all people. It is going to take more time and energy to connect with populations that are less available, especially when board and committee meetings happen in the evening, or are just used to being shut out of the conversation and are maybe less willing to share what they think with us. But as people who are impacted by the decisions that we make, and whether that's 5, 10, or 30 or 50 years down the line, it's really important that we have all of those voices involved in this decision making. All right, Jay, I'm going to let you talk about infrastructure, everyone's favorite topic.
So infrastructure really is key to building affordable housing, having municipal water, wastewater, having housing that is close to transportation, and also just having the land. And we can't do that without public dollars to be able to build effective housing. So one of the things that a town can do around infrastructure is having good zoning. So what you zone for is what you're going to get, because it's it's easiest to build. So if you understand that dense village centered development is the best way to address the housing crisis while also protecting open space and the environment, then communities need to change zoning to allow for multifamily zoning by right. When you require multi-zoning family to get, or multifamily zoning to get a permit, all you're doing is just increasing the cost and just encouraging to have single family houses. So considering a form-based code, or as Amanda described it, design standards, really will help your community agreeing on designing elements, like how you want things to look, not necessarily how many people are going to be living in buildings. Also, in order to create and encourage accessory dwelling units, it's really important to change zoning to make that process easy for homeowners. But there are also other barriers that exist, such as limitations on wastewater. And through the CDP's Lower Cape Housing and ADU Resource Center, we are working with families to make it easier to create accessory dwelling units. We also need to get the best housing, as I said, is local funding sources. And I talked a little bit earlier about all of the different funding sources that are available. There are great advocates such as CHAPA and the Massachusetts Association of Community Development Corporations that are advocating for lots of different funding sources. So let's talk a bit about some of those. As I mentioned, the short-term rental tax is a really important source of funding, but as well as real estate transfer fees. Some of the things that we are just starting to get creative about, though, are actually doing bonding using the steady stream of income, either from Community Preservation Act or the short-term rental tax. That provides us a lot of money up front. But then there are also other communities, such as like Harwich, has used cell phone tower lease payments to fund its affordable housing trust, or using tax title sales to provide resources for affordable housing. And then, as I mentioned, this is just some data here on the short-term rental tax money that is coming in to communities, and it's a significant source of revenue as well that ought to be being used for housing. So having a affordable housing trust and using that trust effectively is a great tool for communities. And it's really important for housing trusts to have action plans. It's also, I think, very important to be using the municipal affordable housing trust legislation to create that trust, and ensuring that trust has a separate board of trustees that's not the select board, so that your trust really is dedicated to working on the housing challenges in a community. And it's also important for that housing trust to have a stable and predictable revenue source. And then it's also really important that towns have a housing coordinator. And we've seen a tremendous success in this in the last several years. It used to be that Michelle Jurashevitz was the only town housing coordinator in Provincetown. And now Eastham, Orleans, Chatham, Brewster, and Harwich all have housing coordinators. And Wellfleet and Truro are working on it. Unfortunately, funding for those positions did not get passed at the ballot box this past year, but we're working with those towns to try again and be successful in making sure that towns have dedicated staff who are working on affordable housing. And then finally, the importance of regional collaboration, because the housing market doesn't respect town lines. It's really important for us to be looking at towns having collaboration with housing projects. The other thing though to keep in mind about this is, we have been looking at towns funding each other's housing projects. I think this is something we ought to be taking a closer look at now, though, particularly because all of our towns now have one or more projects in the development pipeline and really need to be using all of the resources that they have in their community to fund those projects, particularly given the challenges of increased development costs. But there are also ways that we can look at potentially a regional preference in renting up developments, but also look at working with similar developers to work on projects. It might also be possible for a town to come together and let it have two projects coming out together under one RFP. So there are lots of opportunities out there for regional collaboration.
Thank you so much, Jay. All right. So that was a lot of information, and we are going to send out the recording and also all of the resources that we've discussed throughout this slideshow. You can contact Jay or myself if you ever have questions. And as I mentioned, this is the first workshop in our whole curriculum for the 2023-2024 Lower Cape Housing Institute. We actually have another workshop coming up in 2 weeks on the 31st. It isn't spooky. In retrospect, I should have made it spooky to line up with Halloween, but that's okay. It is outweighed by the fact that we have 2 dynamite guest speakers who are going to talk about community engagement, Lily Link from CHAPA and Cassie Infante from AMA, Abundant Housing Massachusetts. And we're going to explore what I talked about a couple of slides ago about community engagement and how we're reaching all of the people whose voices we really need to have in order to make equitable and robust outcomes for our communities as we move into the future. So this is our whole calendar of events, workshops, and peer groups. Registration for everything is open on our website. You can always reach me if you have questions about anything that we've talked about today or anything that we haven't yet talked about. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And amazingly, my background is in teaching high school, and I don't think I ever finished a curriculum on time. So the fact that it is 11:05 and we do indeed have time for some questions, I think is fabulous. So there was one question that I did spot maybe somewhere. If you'd like to raise your Zoom hands, I'm happy to call on people and we can talk about anything that we've covered today, burning questions that you have. All right, we've got one in the chat. Can you describe the most successful person or organization to lead an effort to construct an affordable project? Jay?
So I don't think that there is a most successful person or organization. It really takes collaboration between many people with different skills. I think certainly having strong leadership in a community is really helpful. I think another key part of this is just trying to develop consensus. And there are some really good models out there, both the towns of Orleans and Provincetown. Particularly Provincetown has been going through a process to really develop consensus on initiatives. About 3 years ago, the town manager, Alex Morse, scheduled a series of 3 joint meetings between the Select Board, the Affordable Housing Trust, and the Year-Round Market Rate Rental Trust. And this past year, the Planning Board was brought into these meetings. to basically do a series of meetings leading up to town meeting that advanced a number of initiatives that would that would be on the town meeting warrant. And so, through this process, by bringing the three boards to talk about things, there was a survey that actually that town staff put together first, where they surveyed all of the members and then presented the results of that survey, just trying to get opinions on or gauge support for different initiatives that were being talked about. Was a really effective process to build that support. And Orleans did a similar thing and brought to town meeting really what they called a housing agenda, so that there were 5 to 10 different initiatives that were all brought forward to town meeting. And I think that was a really successful process for moving initiatives forward and moving projects forward, whether they be funding or changes to zoning or updating the inclusionary zoning process law, or even bringing an inclusionary zoning to a town. All of those were really great things to do.
Thank you, Jay. I'll add that it's really important not to think about affordable housing as being separate or its own silo. Being able to advance a whole host of housing strategies really has to be baked into how towns function, both, capital T town being the municipality and lowercase t town being the community and the residents as a whole. And the places where you sort of lay the groundwork and then it pays off as you move through the process and down the line, is what I talked about with vision and planning. So if you're doing long-term planning, getting really robust engagement on what is important to the community and what the community values and what the community sees as its own future. And then housing becomes an outgrowth of achieving that vision. It's baked into things about like sewer and infrastructure. So Orleans is doing a great job and has done a great job changing zoning and putting money into sewer, and the number of units that will be able to come online because of those zoning changes and the sewer capacity is mind-blowing. And that's, a decade, 15, 20 years worth of work, incrementally over time to be able to set the stage for people to be able to take advantage of those changes as they come online. I think having representation and participation on your boards and committees as a municipality, and having good resident engagement, not just at town meeting, but throughout the year, making sure that your residents know what's going on, what projects are coming up, are there surveys available, are there sessions that they can attend. Housing ends up being an outgrowth of all of these other things that we do all of the time, and that are important for the health of a good local government and trust with the people that we serve. If anybody else has questions, feel free to put up your Zoom hand.
There's a question, Amanda, in the chat. Is there any zoning that could be implemented to slow private developers building McMansions? Yes, there are zoning mechanisms that you can add around scale. So for example, Provincetown has a pretty robust scale requirement in its zoning bylaws that really limit the size of buildings in relationship to the size of other buildings in the neighborhood. So that is one mechanism that can be used to limit the size of development. But and then the other mechanism, though, to do that is that if you have good infrastructure and you have zoning that allows for density and multifamily zoning, a developer is going to have way more incentives to build multifamily dense housing than large single family housing. And so, I think one way to look at that is really engage some professionals around creating zoning that is going to support multifamily zoning and make it more attractive to developers to build that kind of housing rather than to be building single family houses.
Thank you, Jay. All right, any last questions? Go ahead, Mary. You got to unmute yourself.
I just want to comment on the short-term rental tax issue. And it's been discussed several times today as a way of using those monies for housing. But in a way, I guess you could call it using for housing, but unfortunately, Eastham is going to have to be using it for its wastewater system. So we need wastewater for dense housing, but it's not going to be used for housing per se.
I'd like to push back a little bit on that, Mary. So we definitely do need to be funding wastewater. That is both to be able to build more dense housing and support affordable housing, but also because we have major water quality issues. And I really question why, particularly in towns like Eastham and Wellfleet on the Outer Cape, where we have significantly high rates of second home ownership. And so basically we have a property tax base that is largely of people who have second homes and have significant equity in those homes and could, through a long-term betterment, pay for the construction of a sewer system. Why are we using one of our most important tools for affordable housing to reduce asking second homeowners and property owners to pay their fair share of wastewater?
Are you talking about the residential tax exemption?
No, I'm just talking about that. So the way you typically finance a sewer, in addition to having some, grant money available, and there are, with the federal spending on infrastructure, there is more grant funding. But ultimately, a lot of the capital to build out a sewer system is provided by the users paying what's called a betterment fee to bring a sewer pipe by their house and would be able to pay a fee over a number of years. That's how most of the sewer systems have been built, because we weren't smart enough on Cape Cod 40 years ago to let Washington D.C. pay for 90% of the cost. But so we have a choice about how to finance it, and I get it's a complicated choice, but I just don't understand why politically we're saying we're fearful of saying to property owners, again, who have seen the value of their houses increase by, in some cases, 100% over the last 10 years. Why are we not comfortable saying you need to pay for wastewater to serve your property so that we can use our short-term rental tax to provide housing for the people who live and work in this community? So I think it is a choice of how to use resources that we ought to have a more robust debate about.
I agree.
And in using all of the rental tax money for this, we're eliminating a really critical resource for us, and we're doing it. And I think a lot of property owners are in a position to be able to to pay a betterment. I know in Provincetown we voted to expand our sewer system over the next 20 years. In my condo here, I'm going to face paying a betterment in a few years, but it's going to be spread out over a 20-year period, and I've seen significant appreciation in the value of my home.
Thank you, Jay. So from the chat, are there current statistics that show the issue of corporations buying private homes and then renting them out for seasonal use only? I'm hearing about this, but do not have hard facts or info, and wondering if someone here does. So the islands, Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, their short-term rental landscape is really much different than ours. And there certainly is a prevalence of investor-owned homes that are only used for short-term rentals on the islands. So Provincetown has the most recent data, Cape side, and Provincetown's study showed that primarily short-term rentals are happening in units that are second homes. So the reason they're being rented short term is because it's a blend of people using them for themselves, and then when they're not there, doing short-term rentals for, to remodel the kitchen or offset some taxes or just have some fun money, whatever. We still have to dig into what level of applicability there is for the rest of the towns in the region. But if that's what Provincetown is seeing, then there's probably a degree of similarity for the other towns in our region. I know that in other places in the country, yes, absolutely, there is a trend of corporations buying up homes and using them expressly as rentals. Our real estate market is already so expensive. I'm not sure that the profit margin is there for corporations to be able to or be interested in buying up homes on Cape Cod to then turn around and rent out. Jay, anything I'm missing?
Yeah, I would just add, Joe, I do think though this is something we ought to look at in communities. Provincetown voters will be considering next week at the special town meeting limiting two measures that would potentially limit corporate ownership of multiple units. And, I think that's something that towns ought to be exploring and considering, because it's certainly a lot better to stop it before it happens than after the train has left the station. And since it is a phenomenon that is happening in other vacation and resort communities, it may be something towns worth considering regulating or prohibiting.
Thank you, Jay.
But it doesn't appear to be a big dynamic at this stage.
Also from the chat, on the betterment taxes, is there a way to make them more affordable for lower income year-round homeowners?
I am not an expert, Sharon, on wastewater financing, but I believe that there are some programs and some resources that can help address this issue of lower income homeowners and not burdening them with a betterment that they can't afford.
Thank you, Jay. All right, any last questions? All right, well, seeing none, thank you all again so much for taking the time to be here. The more people and voices we can have involved in advocating for affordable housing and spreading good information, the easier it makes it on all of us. I will send out a follow-up email with the recording and the resources. As I mentioned, community engagement as a session is coming up in 2 weeks. So I would encourage you to sign up for that as well if you're able. It is going to be, I'm really excited. It's going to be a really fantastic session. And we have a great curriculum lined up for the rest of the year. I am always available if you have questions about just about anything housing related here on the Lower and Outer Cape. And am always more than happy to go discuss over a cup of coffee because I run on caffeine. So with that, Jay.
Yeah, if I could just add, I want to thank Amanda for her very first Housing 101. Great job, Amanda. And most importantly, I want to thank all of you for the tremendous work you all do in your communities to advocate for affordable housing. I know it feels overwhelming and it feels like we can never do enough, but we are making significant progress, and I really appreciate everybody's dedication and desire to work together and their creativity to be advancing housing production in the region. So look forward to seeing more of you at our other upcoming housing institutes, and as always, we're here to help and support you, so let us know what you need. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great Tuesday, everybody.
Thanks, Amanda. Great job.